So while we do a little bit of tech stuff, I wanted to introduce our next speaker. To my knowledge, she is the speaker this time around at the AIGA conference who has traveled the longest way. She's come all the way to us from South Africa. And I think it's kind of fitting because she's offering a long view about time and asking questions like, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? Please welcome to the AIGA stage, Pumla Maswanganyi.
Every design practice performs a worldview. And this talk is about what happens when we choose to expand that view. And this is because whoever defines design defines what design allows to exist. And right now, that definition or script to extend the performance-based metaphors is too narrow. The objects, the systems, and the experiences we design are permissions. They grant life to some things and deny it to others. Therefore, when we design a city or an interface, a policy, or a brand, we're deciding what gets to breathe and what gets erased. Therefore, design truly is governance through form. Me saying this isn't me being poetic or cultural or inspirational. It's truly practical because our future literally depends on how we define things because definitions shape value. So what we build and what we sustain is a result of that. So right now, we are designing systems that are efficient, scalable, and extractive, but they don't necessarily live, because we have mistaken growth for longevity, speed for intelligence, and newness for progress. So the question I want us to sit with is, what kind of design are we rehearsing, as it were, into this world? And what kind of ancestors are we becoming? So think beyond style and aesthetics. Think about the architecture of our thoughts as designers. How we define, perform, and evolve design as a practice, as life. So we're all here due to a series of agreements that we have made with the system within which we exist. And I think one of the things I'd like us to do is to understand how narrow that script has become. And one of the ways we can do this is by just thinking as simply as our definition of time. So we need to look at this core assumption that Western modernity presents, which is the fact that time is linear. It's an external continuum, an independent force always moving forward, whether or not we act within it. So our relationship with it is such that we move through time as some kind of passengers within it, and therefore the future happens to us, and the best we can do is to plan for it, to prepare for it, or to predict it. Therefore, the design logic there is we design to control, anticipate, or to protect against it. And this is why our foresight practices, innovation, and such all feel like a race to get ahead. Yet the Kenyan philosopher and scholar John Mbiti described time as a composition of past and present, and that the future is essentially moving backwards to meet us in the present rather than moving forward. And so ontologically, this means that time is event-based. It comes into existence through human and natural activity. So the human relationship with time in this sense is that we don't just move through it, it unfolds through us. We have greater agency because the future does not necessarily pre-exist elsewhere. It is called into being through what we do in the now. And so the design logic here is that we design not for that future, we design from said future, meaning we act as co-authors of it, not observers, and certainly not as people waiting for it to arrive. So it's not a destination. The future is a responsibility. In this case, circular time doesn't ask what next. It asks what continues. It reframes design as an act of progress, as an act, or rather from an act of progress to an act of continuity. And in that case, every decision is somewhat of a declaration about what tomorrow will be allowed to become. And this brings me to another kind of narrow definition that we have inherited, which is about who even gets to define the frameworks of the future in the first place. Most of our frameworks, I mean, my education was also in the Western world, they come from a minority worldview. We often hear terms like Global South, as if it's some marginal periphery orbiting around the global North, as it were. But statistically, that's absurd, because quite literally, most of the world's population lives in the Global South, therefore actually making it the global majority. We build products for billions, at least that's our aspiration, but we think from the lens of millions. Not only is this unjust, it's honestly inefficient. How many of us question our epistemologies when our products fail? Even when they succeed by popular metrics which we abide by, do we ever wonder how much further they could have gone and how much potential actually lies there? The absence of plural epistemologies or plural knowledge frameworks, if you will, is a blank spot. It's a missed economic, ecological impact and imaginative opportunity. So we need frameworks that actually map onto the lives that inhabit the world. And this is in large part what inspired me to go about the quest of exploring what pluralizing or building upon what I learned would look like, which was then where African Life-Centric Design came into the picture. And fundamentally what ALCD is positioning African cultures and experiences as central nodes in the future innovation and creation landscapes. And it may sound at first kind of like a romanticism or cultural ornamentation or a niche or alt, as the Gen Zs would say, an alt framework, but it isn't, right? So it's beyond style, it's beyond a vibe, but rather goes into the systems of knowing and relating how people live, how they look. And you know, I really wish I could see inside your minds right now into what you think of when you hear the words African design and what it makes you picture. Because my reality and our proposition through ALCD is not about motifs, or it goes beyond multiple colors and materials, but rather expands the very definition of design intelligence itself. And so what we seek to do is to design with difference as a critical ingredient for success, not just celebrating difference. Whether it's a product or a service or a system, it has to be determined and it has to align with the lived realities that it will enter. And the truth of those realities is that they are plural. So if Bauhaus was designed for the machine age, if you will, then ALCD is designed for the age of life, because it combines the ecological intelligence of life-centric design with the cultural depth and plurality of African epistemologies. So yes, it's from Africa, but it's not for Africa alone. It's a blueprint for designing in ways that sustain life everywhere. And so we propose 7 operational principles or methods that inform strategy, policy, innovation, UX, material design, and brand. And those principles are, in no particular order: design as ritual, recognizing origins, centering the periphery, land as a co-designer, communal interdependence, regenerative co-creation, and adaptive resilience. Design as ritual. This is really about valuing design as a sacred process that is connected to larger systems and narratives for spiritual belonging. Not just a flimsy thing that you do, that you get to be a part of, if you will, but really something serving a lot more than just the self. Recognizing origins. This is about immersing oneself in the local design histories and integrating the knowledge of the land and wisdom into our creation and foresight practices. Centering the periphery. So here we prioritize the voices and the views of previously excluded African narratives. So in our practice, which I have to be clear about this, Africa is not the periphery. We're talking about peripheries within Africa. And some of those peripheries include the poor, the disabled, as well as First Nations, which some of the oldest First Nations communities are actually in Africa. And I think of one which is called Ngu, and they are estimated to be 25,000 years old as a nation. And yet you've never heard of them up until right now. And this is the power of the work that we do. Another thing that we tend to think about is when we center realities outside of Silicon Valley, you begin to realize that there is significant, not just innovation potential, but actually innovations that really stem from these frameworks that you're not really familiar with. And one of the things that I thought about actually as I was using Tap to Pay earlier today was M-Pesa, and how what is inherently a Kenyan innovation within mobile money in 2007, which was created in response to the constraints of Western banking structures, which demanded physical presence and tedious documentation and the like, that, which was invented to address that, walked so that Apple Pay could run today, almost a decade later. Doesn't that make you wonder what might be in existence today, here in the States, Europe, etc., if we engaged more closely with other ways of seeing and other ways of living that existed beyond the singular space that we are accustomed to? Land as co-designer. So we seek to honor the living world and anchor all of design within it, not just on top of it. And the pursuit here is to embrace the symbiotic relationship with the ecosystem, considering it as an active participant in the design process. And so our task here is to heed the voice of the land as we would another human around our brainstorming table. As a friend and futurist and partner at ALCD, Monica Bielskita says, she likes to focus in on the fact that 99% of our microbiome is not our own as humans. And therefore, there is truth in the fact that biology really is the next future frontier. And we see that in the fact that most of our human technology is, in fact, simply biomimicry. So what we do here, from an ALCD perspective, is just recognize what is true, which is just embracing the fact that the land has given us the blueprint for us to use. Communal interdependence. So recognizing how every individual contributes uniquely to the larger ecosystem, rooting the design process in tangible communal needs. One of the ways that we've been exploring this, actually, we turned to members of our community to help translate these ALCD principles to 6 official African Union languages as a start, being Spanish, Portuguese, French, Swahili, and Arabic. And in doing so, we challenged our own foundations, as it were, because we wrote this in English, knowing full well that, of course, we are seeking to just even reinvent the languages that we associate with design, but that was the only language we had to describe our theories and our ideas of design. And so within doing that, even just in the act of translating, we have realized that there are a few words that may exist in English that don't exist in indigenous languages, not because the concepts of making or creating are not there, but because they're simply so intuitive and so embodied within that lived experience that they don't need to be defined. And so that on its own teaches you a lot about the prioritization of the people that you're building for. For example, in my language, personally, we don't necessarily have a word for design or create or make. For any of it, I'd use the same word, which is the word do. And I think it speaks to the fact that action is what's prioritized, because we do not rely on a fallacy of a faraway, unpromised tomorrow. Regenerative co-creation. So here we seek to design solutions that emulate and honor nature's circular processes, fostering restoration, nourishment, and renewal. And this is tied very closely to the final one that we'll get into here, which is adaptive resilience. Design for flexibility and adaptability and proactive acceptance of change is a far more resilient stance than that of shock and resistance in the face of it, because change is inevitable. And something that nomadic cultures have always understood is that you need to be prepared for any kind of elements that you will be facing. And it reminds me of this definition, which I can't remember who said it, of risk, which is risk is what's left over after you have factored in everything. And this is imbued within that knowledge, especially when we think about the continuous uncertainty. I mean, from the year 2020 onwards, we've heard the words, we live in unprecedented times, so essentially ad nauseum, that unprecedented times are precedented at this point in time. That's the only time we're used to right now. And so this is questioning, or at least ensuring that we keep to mind the fact that we need to build for adaptation and adaptation and change. So ultimately, this proposition of the ALCD way of seeing just reframes performance metrics, both in business, in actual creation, etc., and reframes them from growth to longevity, from efficiency and the fallacy of speed being better to resilience, and from audience to ecosystem. So friends, will we pass the Ancestor test? I don't know. I think the answer to that lies in how honest we are about the recognition, or rather in recognizing that the next era of celebrated design innovation will be led by those who listen beyond their borders. Thank you.